Hello everybody and welcome back. This is part 2 of our little journey through the 90s to see the evolution of WWE and WCW Wrestling Games over the course of the decade. Now in the first video we looked at the games from the years of 1990 through to 1996. We went from the NES through to the early days of the PlayStation and had a look at about 7 titles of, shall we say, varying quality. For this one, we're going to be looking at the years 1997 through to 1999, which gave us a more significant number of titles and some huge leaps forward in wrestling games. So, without any further preamble, let's get into it. 1996 would end and we would enter the latter part of the decade with the UK in a transitionary period. Tony Blair's Labour government would defeat the Conservatives in the general elections, bringing with them a new sense of optimism for the country. The UK would win the Eurovision Song Contest for the 5th and last time, and we would also see the launch of Channel 5, which was known mostly for and some saucy Friday night content. Video game wise, these were the years that the PlayStation and N64 went from strength to strength. Developers harnessed the power of both systems and were starting to release classic after classic after classic. Sequels came to Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, we saw Metal Gear Solid, the first Siphon Filter game, Ocarina of Time, Banjo-Kazooie, Gran Turismo, Silent Hill, and so much more over these 3 years. And that's not to mention the wide range of wrestling games we got, which we will talk about very shortly. Now, how was Sega doing during this time? Well, the Saturn hadn't done quite as well as they had hoped and was pretty much discontinued around 97-98 in favour of Sega's next system, the Dreamcast, which launched in 1998 in Japan and 1999 everywhere else. For the Dreamcast, we would see classics such as Sonic Adventure, Crazy Taxi, and Shenmue be released in 1999. And now, going over at the world of wrestling, how were we going there? Well, in 1997, the Monday Night Wars raged on. WCW were generally in pole position thanks to the NWO vs WCW storyline, which was captivating fans around the world, with wrestlers like Sting undergoing a darker transformation, the arrival of Bret Hart in late 97, and the rise of Bill Goldberg. It seemed like the sky was the limit for WCW. WWE was starting to take notice though, and 97 saw a period of transformation for them as well. The new generation era was starting to be over and done with, and the Attitude Era had begun. This was being led by stars like Shawn Michaels and Triple H of D-Generation X, The Rock, a much darker version of The Undertaker, and the one and only Stone Cold Steve Austin. Now, whilst both companies engaged in their rivalry, the wrestling business was thriving. Fans were tuning in their millions to watch both of these companies and an upstart ECW at the same time, to follow the exploits of the NWO, to follow Stone Cold Steve Austin, or whatever extreme stuff ECW were doing. WCW and WWE would trade wins in the rating wars over the course of 1998, but things were starting to get a little bit wobbly for WCW. Egos were running rampant, and WWE, thanks to its band of stars, was getting bigger and bigger week on week. 1999 would ultimately see a bigger decline for WCW, while WWE only grew and grew and grew. Now we come to the world of video games. How did these companies fare? It had been a couple of years since WCW had released a game, 1994's disappointing Super Brawl, whilst WWE had been keeping up a fairly steady stream of around 1 or 2 a year across varying platforms. In 97, WWE would actually take a break from releasing anything, so it was WCW's turn to fill the gap that year for wrestling fans. As we have established, WCW was pretty red hot at this time. The NWO story had taken the wrestling world by storm, and WWE, whilst having its good moments, had suffered a lacklustre 95 and 96. So why not capitalise on being on top of the wrestling world by putting out a good old video game? Now, WCW would release 2 games this year, WCW vs. The World and WCW vs. NWO World Tour for N64. Now, whilst I never personally owned WCW vs. the World. I do remember it being one of the earliest wrestling games I ever played. A friend of mine owned it, and to be honest, all we really knew how to do was press a button to make Hollywood Hogan do a dropkick. You know, that famous dropkick that Hulk Hogan was known for? This game was developed by the Manbreeze, and no, I don't understand the name either, and yes, we're just going to breeze past it. WCW vs. the World was a reskin of a Japanese wrestling game called Virtual Pro Wrestling, in an interesting parallel to WCW's first video game. This features a roster of around 60 wrestlers. Interestingly, only 14 of them are from WCW purely, the rest are The World. Fictional wrestlers, which are actually just renamed versions of the roster, featured in Virtual Pro Wrestling, but thanks to licensing issues, they couldn't use the real names. So what's the game like itself? Well, first thing I really noticed here was it had a ridiculously big ring, but beyond that, the game's good. More interestingly, out of all the games we've played so far for these videos, this is the first one to really try and capture the essence of a wrestling match. The premise here was the same as the others, beat your opponent down, try to pin them, but thanks to the addition of a spirit meter which grows and decreases based on yours and your opponent's actions, this feels like an attempt was made to capture the back and forth storytelling nature of professional wrestling. In addition, the game also features dedicated block and dodge buttons to help with manoeuvring around the ring, and you have the ability to counter some moves. It feels like a very different game to what WWE were doing and had been putting out over the past few years. Whilst those games were certainly fun, they felt a bit like fighting games with a bit of wrestling thrown in. This felt like an attempt to accurately portray the act of wrestling itself. Now, was it perfect? No, of course it wasn't. The game is a slow one. The hit detection can feel a little bit off from time to time, and it is not as responsive as what is to come. But with WCW vs. the World, you can see a foundation being put down. This is the game that the Manbreeze, or as they rebranded themselves later, Aki, would build upon as the next few years played out. Now, I don't know if I would recommend purchasing this one, but I would absolutely recommend playing it, just to get an understanding of where this particular lineage of games kind of started, and to know how they progressed later on. Now, part of that progression would occur with their next game, WCW vs. NWO World Tour, that was released later that year, and even more so in 1998 with our next title. In 1998, we would get two more WCW games. We would get WCW Nitro for the PS1 and the N64. This was a game that would receive mixed reviews, and it played a little bit differently to Versus the World. And then we've got this title we are going to talk about. And this is quite a big one. WCW NWO Revenge, released exclusively for the N64 and marking the final WCW game to be developed by Aki before they were brought on board to develop games for WWE. Revenge would see Aki expand even further on those systems that they had been implementing since their days as the Manbreeze with WCW vs. the World. We see more of a continuation of their trademark grappling system. It's easy to use, it's accessible, and it allows matches to play out even closer to what we were seeing on TV. If you tapped B, it would do a weak strike. If you hold it, you'd do a stronger strike. If you tapped A, you'd go into a weak grapple. If you held it, it would go into a strong grapple. If you held a direction with either of these buttons, it would vary the moves. L would dodge, R would block. You pressed them at the right time, you could do a counter. Now, when you pair this with a vast roster of WCW stars, which, as we know, was red hot in 1998, a number of different match types, and the ability to edit your wrestlers' costumes, you have what is probably the pinnacle of WCW video games. There isn't much more to say beyond that. WCW NWO Revenge is brilliant, and it's one of those ones that I think for many people ranks as one of the best, if not the best wrestling game of the 90s. Opinions on that might vary between this one and another one on our list. But what did WWE have to offer in 1998? Releasing in 1998, we finally come to the game which was the first wrestling game that I actually owned, WWF Warzone on the PlayStation 1. Now, I'm going to state up front, I have a lot of nostalgia for both this game and its sequel. I can remember going out on my birthday with my parents to this little independent video game shop in my hometown just to pick this up. I remember getting it home, going into Create a Wrestler, printing off lists of wrestlers from the internet, and making them in this mode, and just having an absolutely wonderful time with it. Warzone, much like the two WCW titles we've mentioned, was more of an attempt to present wrestling properly. Gone was the faster-paced fighting game style of the previous games, gone were the gimmicks and silliness of In Your House, and here we are, back to pure in-ring action. Well, I say pure in-ring action, because WWF Warzone is more like pure pausing the game every 2 seconds to look up the move list for the situation you're in action. Look, right, I absolutely love this game, I adore it, but I can appreciate that when you compare it to what WCW just put out, it doesn't feel great to play. In those games, you pressed up and A and then right and B to do a suplex. In this game, you have to stand close to your opponent, press up, right, square. You know, in Aki's game, it was A and then C down to do an Irish whip. In this, it's forward, backwards, X. It's not the worst thing in the world, and over time, you probably remember these little button combinations, but it wasn't the fluid style we were seeing with Aki's titles. That said, I love it. Warzone has a simple charm to it, which, you know, from the initial menus being elevator themed to the in-ring action itself, the grunts the wrestlers give off and the cheers from the fans, you can see that love has been put into it, and it does become a bit of a decent laugh. Warzone is also known for its hilarious FMV cutscenes of the wrestlers challenging you during its career mode, much like this all-timer.
Those are the stars! They're a push-up! But now, you're fucking ready to get the big dog! Because if you're dumb enough to believe you got what it takes to take on Ahmed Johnson in a perfect powerhouse, then come on! You step right up, baby, and I guarantee you won't be going home!
It's not a bad game. It's not a bad game at all, but I can see how it might be either a touch disappointing compared to what WCW were putting out, or, you know, just a little bit cumbersome to play by modern standards. It does, however, get some bonus points for being one of the first wrestling games to have a Create a Wrestler feature. It's basic, but an attempt was made with it. So that's 1998. What would 1999 bring? In 1998, THQ's publishing deal with WCW would expire, and it would not be renewed, bringing an end to Aki's stint as developer of WCW games. Instead, WCW would partner with Electronic Arts, and a new title, WCW Mayhem, would be released in September of 1999. I remember getting this game in Christmas of 1999, and one of the draws being the ability to fight backstage. I was a little bit familiar with the WCW product at the time. I knew of the NWO, I knew Goldberg, I knew Sting, but I was not a religious watcher, so a lot of the roster was very unfamiliar to me, but I remember enjoying this game all the same. Looking back on it now and playing a handful of matches, it's not a bad little game. The presentation's nice with the entrances, the music and variety of arenas offer. It's a very simple affair, even compared to prior WCW games, and as a result doesn't feel quite as varied, but it's not the worst game in the list. It sits very middling. There isn't really too much to say here beyond what you can kind of see on the screen right now. Now, this would unfortunately be WCW's second last mainstream wrestling game, with WCW Backstage Assault following in 2000. WWE, on the other hand, would have 2 games released in 1999, so let's take a look. When talking about WCW Mayhem, we mentioned that THQ had ended their publishing deal with WCW NWO Revenge. Well, on the WWE side, they were coming to the end of their publishing deal as well, with Attitude marking the last game to be developed and published by Acclaim. We'll talk about it in the next entry, but WWE would actually partner up with THQ for the next title and stick with THQ for quite some time. But let's talk about Attitude first. Well, Attitude takes what Warzone started and expands upon it massively, boasts a deeper Create a Wrestler suite, It allows you to create your own pay-per-views, has a bigger roster, a bigger variety of matches, and a stronger career mode. Gameplay-wise, it's a little bit tighter than Warzone, but it is still the same concept as with these weird button combinations to do the moves, meaning you'll probably spend your first few matches looking up the move lists repeatedly. That said, I adore this game, and it still sits as one of my favourite wrestling games ever. When I think of PS1 wrestling games, I think of this or WWF SmackDown 2. And whilst SmackDown 2 probably edges it out, with that being released in 2000, it doesn't get featured here. That said, not much more to say about it, really. I spent hours and hours on this when I was younger, and it's one that I still really enjoy dipping into now and again, and even streaming it on Twitch for others to see. The only thing this one lacks is the amusing FMV cutscenes. But with that, let's move on to the final title of 1999. Releasing in late 1999 for the N64, WrestleMania 2000 was the first WWF title to be released under new publisher THQ. Developed by Aki Corp, the game is actually a little bit of a rarity as far as wrestling games go, because it took its name from an event that had yet to happen. Being developed by Aki, this game is a natural follow-up to WCW NWO Revenge. It features the same match engine, it builds upon what had come before, as well as introducing WWE staples to the game, such as the Royal Rumble and King of the Ring mode. Players could also create their own wrestler here, as well as edit any of the wrestlers' attire on the roster. Much like Revenge, WrestleMania 2000 is absolutely brilliant. Incredibly simple to pick up and play, it's spot on with the presentation for the time, and it's got enough depth to satisfy wrestling fans, making it one of the best wrestling games of the 90s. The only thing I dislike about it is the Road to WrestleMania mode, which is the game's single player mode. Concept of it is fine, you work your way up for titles, defend them, but the problem is you can't set a difficulty level for this mode like you can in the main game itself. Instead, the mode will adjust difficulty based on your opponents or matches. So you could be having an easy singles match one week, next week your opponents are capable of reversing everything you do, leading to significant frustration. That, to me, is the main flaw with it. But you can always find a cheat code or something to unlock everyone to make use of in the pay-per-view or King of the Ring modes to set it up exactly how you want. So it's a minor issue, really. Would I recommend this one? Absolutely. Now, I know there is another game coming up in 2000, which probably pips this one to the post for many people as the best wrestling game of the generation and maybe of all time. But for the 90s, this one, or WCW NWO Revenge, stand head and shoulders above the rest. So we've got to the end, we've got to 1999, let's wrap this thing up. We're finally at the end of our little jaunt through the 90s. We've gone from the very beginning, some of the earliest WWE and WCW games in 1990, to some of the best titles in the genre with Aki's contributions in 1999. Our journey has taken us from the latter days of one company's golden era through to some of its lowest points and back into one of its most popular periods. With WCW, we went from its formational days to its huge rise, and then at the end of 1999, a dramatic fall. We started with 8-bit and ended with the heights of the N64. We've seen consoles come and go and play styles change and evolve over the years. Now, if I were to pick my favourites from the games played, they're obvious choices, but the N64 titles, WrestleMania 2000, WCW NWO Revenge stand head and shoulders above what everyone else was doing at the time. They're easy enough to jump into, they do a good job of reflecting the essence of wrestling, and they have great rosters capturing the stars of the time. Now, nostalgia is telling me to pop WWF Attitude in there as well because of what it means to me personally. But, of course, we kind of have established that in that generation, WrestleMania 2000 and WCW NWO Revenge were probably better games. That said, I also have a soft spot for WWF Raw from the 16-bit era too after playing it, so I would definitely recommend checking that out. Now, what would the future hold for grappling games, though? Well, after splitting with WWE for Attitude, Acclaim would go on to make a few more wrestling games for ECW, of all people. They would build on what they started with Warzone and Attitude, and unfortunately, both the games they made for ECW were received rather poorly compared to what else was out at the time. WCW would manage one more game before they went under in early 2001. This would be WCW Backstage Assault, a game based on the idea of fighting backstage, with every match contested under hardcore rules. It would be poorly received and mark a fairly poor end to WCW's pretty solid run of video games. In 2000, however, WWE and Aki would release what many consider to be the greatest wrestling game of all time, WWF No Mercy for the N64. This game built upon everything Aki had done in previous games and was pretty much their definitive title, and is still much loved to this day. On the PlayStation side of things, WWE would partner with Ukes, and they would launch the SmackDown franchise, which would go on to be the most popular wrestling series, with SmackDown 2 being a particular highlight for me, and the fifth title, Here Comes the Pain, being another highlight for many. As the next generation rolled on, WWE would release a vast number of titles across the systems. Xbox would see Raw, Raw 2 and WrestleMania 21, the GameCube had WrestleMania 18, WrestleMania 19, and 2 Day of Reckoning games. The PlayStation would continue the SmackDown series. SmackDown would later be rebranded as SmackDown vs. Raw in 2004, and it would remain exclusive to the PlayStation until 2007, which saw it release on both PS2 and Xbox 360. SmackDown vs. Raw would become the kind of mainline title for wrestling games, and it would be one released yearly for Sony and Microsoft platforms until it was rebranded as just WWE 12 in its 2011 edition. THQ would unfortunately go under in 2012, and Take-Two would obtain the rights to WWE titles, launching the 2K series, which despite some ups and downs is still going to this day. And with all of that said, I would like to thank each and every one of you very much for taking the time to watch these videos, and I really hope you enjoyed them. I would absolutely love to hear your stories and experiences with any of the games mentioned, or just wrestling games in general. So please do let me know. I want to know what your favourites are. I want to know which ones you liked that selected here. Any hidden gems out there, do leave a comment below. And please do share the videos far and wide with your friends. And, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more retro gaming stuff. Until next time, thank you once again for taking the time to watch these. I really do appreciate it. And I hope to see you again in a future video. Goodbye.